This story is designed to help you drift off into a peaceful, restful sleep. Where are you listening from? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and join me as we journey into peaceful dreams together. Sweet dreams, everyone. The wind howled through the cracked window, carrying with it the distant sound of a siren that faded almost as quickly as it came. The kitchen clock ticked loudly, each second gnawing at Evelyn's nerves. She sat at the small dining table, her phone face down beside her, staring at the untouched plate of food in front of her. It had been 3 nights now. 3 nights of the same thing. The calls came at exactly 12:15 a.m., without fail. No number, no voice. Just the eerie sound of static that filled her ears like a suffocating fog. Evelyn had tried ignoring it at first, but last night, the static turned into something else. Breathing. Slow, deliberate, and impossibly close. Tonight, she decided she would answer again. Not just out of curiosity, but because she needed it to stop. The clock read 12:14. 1 minute to go. She tightened her grip on the edge of the table, her knuckles pale and rigid. The kitchen light buzzed faintly, flickering just enough to make the shadows seem alive. She scanned the room, her eyes darting to the sliding glass door behind her. The curtain swayed, though there was no draft. She told herself there was nothing. It had to be nothing. At 12:15 sharp, the phone buzzed violently, rattling against the wooden table. Evelyn flinched, her pulse pounding in her ears. She stared at the screen. No caller ID. She hesitated, her trembling hand hovering over the phone. The ringing continued, each tone slicing through the air like a knife. She pressed the green button and held the phone to her ear. Hello. Her voice was steadier than she expected, though the tightness in her chest betrayed her calm. At first, there was only static, that thick, suffocating static that made her stomach churn. She gritted her teeth and tried again. Who is this? What do you want? The static wavered, crackling as if something was trying to push through. And then, she heard it, a voice. Soft, almost a whisper. Evelyn, don't. The line went dead. Her heart pounded as she stared at the screen. The call had ended, but her phone vibrated again, this time with a text. The words sent a chill crawling down her spine. I'm closer than you think. She whipped her head toward the sliding glass door. The curtain was no longer swaying. It was still, too still. And then, the faint outline of a hand pressed against the glass. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as the hand remained pressed against the glass, pale and motionless. Her eyes refused to blink, afraid that even a flicker of darkness would erase the fragile line between her and whatever was on the other side. Her mind raced. Was it a trick of the light? A smudge? But no, the shape was too distinct. The fingers splayed just enough to make the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. Slowly, she pushed herself out of her chair, her knees trembling beneath her. The phone still clung to her palm, its screen lighting up her ghostly pale face as she took one cautious step forward. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator behind her. She stopped a few feet from the door, her body tense as her gaze locked onto the glass. The hand was gone. Her chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths. She pressed her lips together to keep from gasping too loudly, her mind screaming for her to retreat, to turn every light on in the house and call for help. But something kept her rooted in place, a gnawing feeling that leaving the door unguarded would be a mistake. Then she saw it, a faint shape in the reflection of the glass. Not her own, but something darker, deeper in the shadowy yard. It shifted ever so slightly, almost blending into the night. Evelyn's stomach twisted as she reached out, her fingers brushing the cold metal edge of the curtain rod. She yanked the curtain shut in one sharp motion and backed away, clutching the phone to her chest. The text message was still open on the screen. I'm closer than you think. Her mind replayed the words, twisting them, dissecting their meaning. She didn't know what scared her more, the possibility that it was a sick prank or the sinking suspicion that whoever had sent it meant every word. Her phone buzzed again. She nearly dropped it, her fingers fumbling to flip it over. This time, it wasn't a text. It was another call. No ID. She stared at the screen, her throat dry and tight. The ringing persisted, relentless and shrill. She couldn't bring herself to answer. Not this time. But as the call ended and the silence returned, her phone buzzed again. Another text. "Don't hide from me, Evelyn." Her blood ran cold. Whoever this was, they could see her. They knew exactly what she was doing. Evelyn bolted for the hallway, flipping light switches as she went. The darkness receded behind her as she reached the bedroom and slammed the door shut. She locked it and leaned against the wooden frame, her pulse racing in her ears. She dialed 911, her fingers trembling as she pressed each number. She brought the phone to her ear, expecting the comforting voice of a dispatcher, but all she got was static. Her hand shook as she lowered the phone and stared at the screen. The signal bars flickered erratically before vanishing altogether. And then, the faint sound of footsteps echoed from the kitchen. Evelyn's heart stopped. She wasn't imagining it. Someone was in the house. She dropped the phone onto the bed, her gaze darting around the room for anything she could use to defend herself. Her hands closed around a heavy metal flashlight sitting on the nightstand. The footsteps grew louder, deliberate and unhurried, as though whoever was out there wanted her to know they were coming. Evelyn positioned herself by the door, her knuckles white as she gripped the flashlight. Every muscle in her body tensed, her ears straining for the next sound. Then, just outside the door, the footsteps stopped. She held her breath, her heart hammering so loudly she thought it might give her away. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. And then, with a soft creak, the doorknob began to turn. Evelyn's grip tightened on the flashlight as the doorknob twisted ever so slightly, then stopped. The silence on the other side of the door was suffocating, broken only by the faint hum of electricity in the house. She could feel the cold sweat on her palms and the back of her neck. Whoever, or whatever, was on the other side was toying with her. The seconds stretched unbearably. Then came the first knock, a sharp, deliberate rap against the wood. Knock, knock. It wasn't frantic. It wasn't aggressive. It was calm, measured, and chilling in its simplicity. Evelyn didn't dare make a sound. She could feel her heart thundering in her chest, as if it might betray her presence. Another knock, and then a voice. "Evelyn," it whispered through the door, low and gravelly, almost unrecognizable. Her name on the stranger's lips made her knees weaken. How did they know her? Why were they here? Her mind screamed for her to run, but there was nowhere to go. Not without passing through whatever waited for her in the hallway. She forced herself to take a breath. If she was going to survive this, she needed to think. Her eyes darted to the windows. They were locked, but if she could open one quickly, she might have a chance to slip out into the night. She shuffled toward the window on her toes, her bare feet barely making a sound against the carpet. As she reached for the latch, the voice came again, louder this time. "I know you're in there, Evelyn. Why don't you open the door?" She froze. The flashlight felt heavy in her hands. Her lungs burned as she held her breath, praying the intruder would give up and leave. Instead, the voice softened into something more unsettling. "Do you remember me?" Her fingers trembled on the latch. Remember them? No. She didn't know who this was. She didn't recognize the voice, though there was something about the tone, familiar yet distorted, as though it was being dragged through layers of static and malice. Suddenly, the handle rattled violently. Evelyn let out a sharp gasp as the doorframe shuddered under the force. Whoever was on the other side was no longer patient. The rattling stopped, replaced by heavy, deliberate footsteps retreating down the hall. Her pulse raced as she listened. They were moving away, but where? Her ears strained for every sound, every creak of the floorboards. Then it hit her. The front door. If they left through the front door, she could make a run for it. Evelyn crept to her bedroom door, placing her ear against the wood. She heard nothing but the faint echo of the wind outside. She unlocked the door as quietly as she could and pulled it open a fraction. The hallway was empty, the shadows seeming to shift as the house settled. Flashlight in hand, she stepped out, her feet moving with calculated precision. She made her way toward the front of the house, her breath shallow, her eyes scanning every corner. When she reached the living room, her stomach sank. The front door was wide open. The cold night air rushed in, carrying with it the faint scent of rain. Evelyn approached cautiously, peering out into the yard. The porch light flickered above her, casting erratic shadows over the driveway and the tree line beyond. For a moment, she felt relief. Maybe whoever it was had left. Maybe it was over. Then she saw it. In the middle of the driveway, a figure stood motionless, silhouetted against the pale moonlight. It was too far away to make out its features, but its posture was unmistakable, rigid, waiting, its head tilted ever so slightly toward her. Evelyn's breath quickened as the figure raised its arm, pointing at her. The phone in her pocket buzzed, startling her so badly she nearly dropped the flashlight. She yanked it out and glanced at the screen. Another text. "You shouldn't have opened the door." Before she could process the message, the figure in the driveway began to move, slowly, toward her. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as the figure in the driveway took a deliberate step forward. It wasn't rushing, wasn't frantic. It was measured, calm, almost predatory. Each movement sent a fresh wave of panic through her veins. She stepped back slowly, her mind screaming at her to act, but her body felt rooted to the spot, as if she were paralyzed by the weight of what was happening. The figure's pace was unhurried, but it was getting closer. Evelyn quickly backed toward the kitchen, her footsteps light against the floor. Her hand brushed against the counter, knocking over a glass. It shattered, its sharp sound sending a jolt through her. She froze, hoping against hope that the noise hadn't attracted attention. From the driveway, the figure stopped, and then the air shifted. The temperature seemed to drop in an instant, and Evelyn's breath became visible in the dim light of the kitchen. She shivered, her pulse racing as the floor creaked outside the open door. The figure wasn't moving anymore. It was waiting, watching. Her mind whirled there had to be a way out. Her phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen, but this time, no text appeared. There was just a new call, no ID, as usual. Evelyn's hand shook as she answered. "Evelyn," the voice rasped, more distorted this time, barely a whisper. "I see you." The blood drained from her face. It wasn't just a voice on the phone anymore. There was something closer, something she couldn't escape. Her eyes darted around the kitchen, the back door. If she could reach it, she might be able to get to the neighbor's house. She moved silently toward it, but as she approached, her eyes widened. A shadow loomed just outside the door, blocking the exit. Her heart slammed against her ribcage as she stepped back, the phone still pressed to her ear. "You can't hide, Evelyn," the voice continued, now mocking, like a taunt. "I'll always find you." She slammed the phone down, her mind racing. What had she done? What did they want from her? Panic clawed at her chest, but she couldn't afford to break down. The door handle rattled again. She turned, frantic, and grabbed the nearest object, a knife from the drawer. Her fingers closed around the cold steel, and for a moment, the weight of it steadied her. But the rattling didn't stop. Evelyn moved to the kitchen window, pulling aside the curtain just enough to peek outside. The figure hadn't moved. It was still standing in the driveway, but now it was staring directly at her. She quickly pulled away, her pulse racing again. She couldn't stay here. Suddenly, there was a loud knock on the back door. 3 sharp raps. "Evelyn," the voice was louder now, coming from the back, not through the phone. It was close, too close. Her hands trembled as she held the knife in front of her. Was this a person or something else? She backed into the corner of the kitchen, trying to make herself as small as possible. The air was thick, suffocating, as though the house itself were closing in around her. And then, with a suddenness that made her jump, the back door burst open. The figure from the driveway was standing in the doorway, its outline dark against the porch light. Evelyn's heart stopped. There wasn't just one figure. There were 2. The second figure stepped forward into the light, and Evelyn's blood ran cold. She recognized the face. It was someone she knew, someone she hadn't seen in years. Her hand shook so violently that she nearly dropped the knife. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered, barely able to keep the tremor out of her voice. The figure didn't answer. It just stepped forward, and Evelyn could see the glint of something sharp in their hand, a knife of their own. The first figure stepped closer to her. Its face remained obscured, but there was no mistaking the malice in the way it moved. "I told you, Evelyn," the voice whispered again. "You can't hide. You're mine now." Her mind was racing, trying to process everything at once. The figure, the familiar face, the whispers, everything was spiraling into chaos. What did they want from her? And why? Evelyn felt a cold sweat running down her back as she backed into the corner. She had to escape. There had to be a way out. But as she looked around, all she saw were the shadows closing in on her. Evelyn's mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest as the two figures moved closer. The one in the doorway, the one she didn't recognize, stepped forward with unnerving calmness. The other, the face she knew so well, stood motionless, knife in hand, watching her with cold, unblinking eyes. The air felt thick and suffocating, the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. Her hands tightened around the knife, the cold metal of faint comfort against her shaking fingers. She tried to steady her breath, but it was impossible. "Please, just tell me what you want," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The one in the doorway smiled, a slow, calculating grin that made her stomach turn. "What we want, Evelyn, that's not the question. The question is what you'll do to survive." She glanced between the two figures, her mind spinning. There was no way out of the kitchen without going through them. The back door was still open, but that didn't matter. The figure in the driveway was still there, unmoving, as though it were waiting for something. "Why are you doing this?" she repeated, more desperately this time. The familiar face, her old friend, someone she trusted, finally spoke, his voice low and haunting. "You think this is about you? No, Evelyn. This is about what you've kept from everyone, what you thought you could bury." Her stomach dropped. What did he mean? She didn't understand. She had no secrets. Or did she? The figure in the doorway took another step forward, its eyes glinting in the dim light. "You've always known, haven't you? You've always known we were watching, that we were waiting." Evelyn's pulse hammered in her ears. There was something about the way they spoke that made her feel as if they were playing a game she hadn't even known she was part of. "No," she whispered. "No, you're wrong. I've never—" The figure in the doorway cut her off with a laugh, sharp and cruel. "You never thought you'd have to face it, did you? That's the thing about secrets, Evelyn. They don't stay buried forever." She stumbled back a step, her heart racing in her chest. What was he talking about? She didn't have any secrets. Or did she? The figure in the doorway stepped forward again, the tension in the room thickening with every movement. "You've been running from the truth your whole life, and now it's time to face it." Suddenly, the front door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Evelyn whipped around, her heart leaping into her throat. The figure in the driveway was gone. She couldn't breathe. What was happening? Before she could turn back to the two figures in the kitchen, she heard a sound, a whisper, coming from the back of the house. It was faint at first, just a shuffling, a soft scraping sound. Then louder. Someone else was here. The figure in the doorway paused, its head turning toward the sound. Evelyn's eyes darted to the window in the living room. If she could just get to the window. If she could get out of the house. But the figure in the doorway smiled again. That same, chilling smile. "Don't bother, Evelyn. There's nowhere to run." Her heart dropped to her stomach. They knew. They knew everything. The scraping sound grew louder, closer. She had to act. There was no more time. She needed a plan. She had to fight, to escape. But as she turned to face the familiar face, her old friend, something changed. The coldness in his eyes deepened, something darker taking hold. His voice was low, barely a whisper. "You don't remember, do you, Evelyn? You don't remember what you did?" Evelyn's mind raced, a torrent of images flashing through her thoughts. Her breath caught in her throat. What was he talking about? I don't... But before she could finish, the scraping sound grew louder, and the back door swung open, a shadow filling the frame. Evelyn's breath hitched. There, standing in the doorway, was a third figure. This one was different. It wore a mask, its features obscured, but its presence felt wrong. Something about it seemed more menacing than the others. and in its hand, it held something long and sharp, another knife. "Evelyn," the voice in the doorway rasped, a slow, deliberate drawl. "You should have stayed hidden. Now it's too late." The figure stepped inside, its eyes locking onto hers. The two in the kitchen didn't move, didn't speak. They were waiting for something, and Evelyn felt like the prey caught in a snare. She had no time left. There was no way out. And then, in the deepest part of her mind, the truth hit her like a thunderclap. She wasn't just being hunted. She was part of it. The stakes had just escalated. Evelyn's heart raced, her mind struggling to catch up with the realization. The truth, the one she had buried deep, locked away for years, finally surfaced. She wasn't just some innocent target. She was part of this. She was part of the game. The figure with the mask moved closer, its eyes hidden, but its presence suffocating, like the weight of impending doom. Evelyn's body trembled, the cold sweat on her skin turning into an icy chill that numbed her fingertips. The two others, her old friend, the one she had trusted, did nothing. They just stood there, silent, watching, waiting. The scraping sound had stopped, replaced by the low hum of the house's heating system. The quiet was almost worse now, the stillness pressing in from every side. The figure with the mask raised its knife slowly, deliberately, its movements smooth and methodical. Evelyn's breath hitched as it stepped closer, every movement seeming to stretch time. "You've been running for too long," the masked figure said, its voice cold and hollow, devoid of any empathy. "Now it's time to pay the price." Evelyn's mind screamed at her to do something, anything, but her limbs felt paralyzed, trapped in the fear that gripped her. The sharp edge of the knife reflected the dim light, drawing her gaze to it, even though every instinct in her told her to look away. The figure took another step. She had to act. There had to be a way out. Her fingers clenched tighter around the knife she still held, the metal feeling foreign and heavy in her hands. The figure was closing in, but there was no way she could overpower it, not with two others standing in her way. She couldn't face all three of them, unless... Her eyes flickered to the window. The porch light outside still flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the yard. A thought sparked in her mind. The back door, the one they'd just entered from. There was still a chance to run. She wasn't sure where she would go, but she knew she had to try. Her muscles screamed as she bolted toward the door, the knife still gripped in her hand, her feet pounding against the floor as she moved faster than she ever thought she could. But before she could reach the hallway, she heard the voice again, this time sharp, commanding. "Stop!" The word cut through the air like a whip. It wasn't a request, it was an order. Evelyn froze in her tracks. The figure with the mask had already moved to block her path, its presence closing in around her. She hadn't even seen it move. The chilling air around her seemed to thicken. She turned to face the others, but they hadn't moved. They were just watching, waiting, like they were witnessing something inevitable. "I told you, Evelyn," the masked figure said, its voice now almost a hiss. "There's no escape." Her breath came in shallow gasps. There had to be something she could do, but her mind felt clouded, every thought tangled in the terror that gripped her chest. The familiar figure, her friend, the one who had once been her closest confidant, finally spoke again. His voice was eerily calm, as if he had already accepted the outcome. "You can't keep running. You can't bury the truth any longer." Evelyn's mind reeled. What truth? What were they talking about? She had no idea what they were referring to. None of this made sense. But one thing was clear. They wanted something from her. The masked figure stepped closer, the blade in its hand gleaming with an unsettling precision. "Don't listen to them," the familiar voice continued, growing more urgent. "You have to face it, Evelyn. This is your only chance." Her gaze flicked to the door. It was still open. She could make a break for it. She had to. She had no choice. Without thinking, Evelyn lunged toward the back door, her heart hammering in her chest. She was faster this time, propelled by the raw instinct to survive. But before she could reach the threshold, the figure with the mask was there, blocking her again. It was impossibly fast, its body moving with an unnatural precision. "Running is useless," it said, its voice cold, metallic. "The more you try, the more you'll lose. Evelyn's pulse thundered in her ears. She was trapped. She had no way out. And then, with a sudden, eerie clarity, she understood. This wasn't just about her survival. This was about something much bigger. Something that had been looming over her for years. Something she had buried deep enough that even she had almost forgotten. They weren't just after her. They were after the truth. The one secret she had never dared to confront. The stakes weren't just her life anymore. They were something far worse. Evelyn's breath came in ragged gasps as the weight of the realization settled over her. The truth. What truth? Her mind scrambled, trying to piece together fragments of memories. But it felt like trying to grasp smoke. She'd buried something deep, something that could unravel everything. But what was it? The figure with the mask didn't move. It just stood there, its eyes hidden but its presence suffocating. The knife gleamed menacingly in its hand, but it wasn't the weapon that held her captive. It was the atmosphere, the silence, the tension that hung in the air like a storm about to break. You don't have much time left. The masked figure's voice sliced through the quiet. The longer you resist, the harder it will be to let go. Evelyn felt the walls of the house close in on her. Every part of her screamed to run, to fight, but something held her back. It wasn't just fear. It was the weight of the unknown, the truth she couldn't quite remember, but could feel gnawing at the edges of her mind. Behind her, her old friend Jason moved a step closer. His eyes were locked on her, dark and empty. There was no trace of the person she had once known. No kindness, no warmth. Only a cold, calculating emptiness. "You've always known, Evelyn." Jason's voice was almost a whisper, but it carried a weight that made her shiver. "You think you've been running from them, from this, but you've been running from yourself." Evelyn's hand tightened around the knife she still held, the cold metal almost grounding her, but she didn't know what to do with it. She couldn't even bring herself to look at Jason. She couldn't understand him. He wasn't the person she remembered. "Tell me what you want," she whispered, her voice shaking despite her efforts to remain calm. "What do you want from me?" Jason took another step forward, his face twisted in something like pity. Or was it disdain? "It's not about what we want, Evelyn. It's about what you need." A chill ran down her spine. The way he said it, so certain, so final. It felt like a sentence. The figure with the mask stepped forward then, closing the distance between them. "The truth is simple, Evelyn," it said, its voice softer now, almost coaxing. "You're not just being hunted. You're being tested. Your fate was sealed the moment you forgot what you did." Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the words. They weren't just threatening her. They weren't here for her blood or her life. They were after something far more elusive. The truth she couldn't remember. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, her voice strained. "You will," the masked figure replied cryptically. Evelyn's eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything, to give her a sense of control. But everything was closing in on her. The masked figure in front, Jason behind her, the oppressive silence suffocating her every breath. Her hand shook around the knife. She had to do something. In a sudden surge of desperation, Evelyn lunged forward, swinging the knife. It was a wild, frantic movement, born of pure survival instinct. But the figure with the mask was ready. It grabbed her wrist before the blade could make contact, twisting her arm with inhuman strength. The pain shot through her arm like fire, but she barely had time to react before the masked figure shoved her back. She stumbled, falling to the floor with a sickening thud. "You can't fight what you don't understand," the figure said, its voice almost sympathetic now. Evelyn's breath came in ragged gasps as she pushed herself to her feet. Every part of her screamed to escape, but she had nowhere to go. There was nowhere left to run. Jason's eyes flickered to the knife, then back to her. "You think you can fight your way out of this? It's not about strength, Evelyn. It's about understanding the truth. It's about facing what you've done." Evelyn's head throbbed as the memories started to resurface in fractured glimpses. Something dark, something she had done. She couldn't remember, but she could feel it, a weight pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. The masked figure tilted its head, studying her. "You'll remember soon enough. When you do, it will all make sense." But the question is, can you live with it? Evelyn's eyes shot to Jason, searching for any trace of the person she had once known. But there was nothing there. The person he was now, it wasn't him. What are you talking about? What have I done? She demanded, her voice trembling. Jason didn't answer. Instead, he just stared at her with cold, unfeeling eyes. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. The masked figure stepped back, as though giving her space. But Evelyn knew better. It was only stepping back to allow the truth to settle over her, to let it sink in, to make her understand. And then, as if the room had been holding its breath, a sharp sound broke through the tension, a voice. It wasn't the masked figure. It wasn't Jason. It was coming from the front door. Evelyn's head snapped toward the sound. Evelyn. The voice was familiar, but it sent a wave of dread crashing over her. It wasn't anyone she wanted to hear right now. It was her mother. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a shadow standing in the doorway. The figure's face was hidden, but the voice was unmistakable. "Mom," Evelyn whispered, her heart dropping into her stomach. The stakes had just changed once again. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as the voice from the doorway echoed in her ears. Mom, it couldn't be. She hadn't heard her mother's voice in years, not since the night her entire life had been upended, the night she'd buried everything. But now there it was, unmistakable. The same voice she had once trusted, the same voice that had soothed her nightmares. The figure in the doorway stepped forward, but the dim light from the hallway obscured its features. Evelyn's eyes widened, straining to make out the person standing there. Was it really her mother? Her throat went dry. "Mom," she whispered again, this time more forcefully, hoping it would make sense of the growing unease inside her. But the figure didn't respond right away. It just stood there, as if studying her. Jason's face twisted into a cold smile, his eyes flickering to the doorway. "You think she's here to save you? You've been running from the truth for so long, Evelyn. Even your own mother can't change that." Evelyn's stomach lurched. She looked back toward the door, desperate for some confirmation. Was it truly her mother? Had she come to help? Or was this just another part of the game? The figure in the doorway finally moved, stepping into the light. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't her mother. It was someone else entirely. A man. He was tall, with a dark coat that hung loosely from his shoulders. His face was obscured by a mask, different from the one worn by the figure in the kitchen. This mask was darker, its design intricate but unsettling. The eyes of the mask were hollow, devoid of any trace of humanity. And yet, there was something deeply familiar about the way the figure stood, poised and controlled. "Evelyn," the figure said, his voice low and calm, almost gentle. It wasn't her mother's voice at all. Her mind reeled. Asterisk, who was this? Why did they all keep playing these games with her? Asterisk. The masked figure in the kitchen stepped closer, its presence almost suffocating. But still, Jason remained frozen, his eyes flickering with something unreadable. "You really don't get it, do you?" Jason said, the coldness in his tone like ice. "They're all here for you, Evelyn. Every one of them. Every moment you've been running. Every lie you've told yourself. It's all led to this. They came because of you." The new figure, this man with the unfamiliar mask, moved toward her. Every step sent a tremor through her body. "Stop," she said, her voice shaking with desperation. She was starting to feel cornered, like a rat trapped in a cage. The walls seemed to close in tighter, as if the house itself was alive, aware of her every movement. "Tell me why you're here," Evelyn demanded. She gripped the knife tighter in her hand, though she didn't know if it would be enough. The man with the mask didn't answer right away. He simply reached up, as though adjusting something about his mask. "Finally," he spoke, his voice eerily calm. "You're closer to the truth than you think, Evelyn. But you still don't understand. You still think you're in control." Evelyn's breath caught. She wanted to scream, to lash out, to break free from the stranglehold of fear that wrapped around her chest. But the words he spoke, the cold certainty of them, they made her doubt everything she knew. "You think I'm in control," she snapped, trying to hold her ground. "You think I'm the one who has the answers?" You've got it all wrong. I don't know what any of this is about. I don't know why you're here. I don't know why you." The masked man moved faster than she expected, his hand darting out to grab her wrist, his grip like iron. "You will understand soon enough," he said, his voice cold, unyielding. She tried to break free, but his hold was unrelenting. The knife in her hand felt heavy and useless now, just another thing that could turn against her. Her mind spun wildly. Who were they? Why was she at the center of this twisted game? Jason's voice broke through her thoughts, his words heavy with something that might have been regret. "You can't run from what you are, Evelyn. You can't hide from the truth forever. You are the key. You always have been." She didn't know what he meant. The confusion swirled deeper, the fog in her mind growing thicker by the second. Was she supposed to remember something? What was it they wanted from her? The masked man spoke again, his voice softer this time. "Remember?" Evelyn's eyes snapped back to his, but she could see nothing in the empty hollows of his mask. "Remember what?" she demanded. "I don't know what any of you are talking about. Tell me." The figure in the doorway, her mother, or who she had thought was her mother, finally moved forward. Her footsteps were slow, deliberate, but this time the mask shifted. It wasn't just a mask. It was a face she knew. Her mother, but there was something wrong about her eyes. Something cold and distant that didn't belong. "Evelyn," the woman said, her voice not at all like the soft, caring tone Evelyn had once heard. It was detached, almost mechanical. "It's time to wake up." Evelyn felt something snap inside her, an instinct, an urgent need to break free. She wasn't sure how, but she knew she had to. This wasn't her mother. This wasn't even real. But as she stared at the woman's face, the memory surged forward. Not the past she had carefully constructed, but something darker, something hidden. And in that moment, Evelyn realized something terrifying. This wasn't just a game. This was her reckoning. Evelyn's pulse quickened, the room spinning around her as she faced the person she had once called her mother. The woman's face was the same, identical to the one in her memories, but there was something hollow in her eyes now, something that felt wrong, foreign. It was as if the woman in front of her was a stranger wearing a mask of familiarity. "Wake up, Evelyn," her mother's voice repeated, a cold, robotic monotone now. "The truth is waiting." The word sent a shiver down Evelyn's spine. "Truth? What truth?" Jason's voice interrupted her thoughts, sharp and cold. "You're still in denial. You haven't learned a damn thing, have you? It's too late for that now." Evelyn's breath came in shallow bursts. The weight of Jason's words crashed over her, suffocating her. Denial. She had no idea what he was talking about, no idea what kind of game they were playing. But the pressure, the sense of something looming just beyond her grasp, was unbearable. She could feel it tightening around her, slowly suffocating her from every direction. The masked figure behind her mother moved forward, its presence an overwhelming shadow. The air in the room grew colder, heavier, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees in a matter of seconds. "Don't fight it, Evelyn," the masked figure said softly. "You know what you did. The longer you resist, the harder it will be to bear." Evelyn's mind raced. What had she done? Her thoughts were a blur, scattered fragments of a life she couldn't piece together. She had run for so long, escaped the memories, the faces, the shadows of the past. But now they had found her. They were all here, circling around her, like vultures waiting for the inevitable. Her hand tightened around the knife once more, but it felt like a useless gesture. The sharp edge seemed insignificant compared to the dark weight pressing down on her chest. What could she possibly do to stop this? To stop them? Her eyes flicked back to Jason, his cold expression now a mask of certainty. "There's no point in pretending anymore," he said, his words devoid of any compassion. "This isn't about survival, Evelyn. This is about facing what you've been running from, about finally accepting the consequences." Evelyn shook her head, the edges of her vision blurring. The consequences. She wouldn't accept any of this. But it was like a storm was gathering inside her, a tempest she couldn't stop, couldn't contain. The truth, whatever it was out of her control. The figure with the mask stepped even closer, its movements silent and fluid, like a shadow that refused to fade. You don't remember, do you? It's not surprising. You buried it deep. But the truth always comes back. Evelyn's hand trembled. She looked down at the knife again, the cold metal glinting in the dim light. What could it do? How could it help her now? You can't escape your past, Evelyn, Jason said, his voice filled with a twisted kind of finality. It's here. It's been here all along. Her breath hitched, her chest tightening with a mixture of fear and frustration. She had to get out. She had to break free. But the walls felt like they were closing in, like the very house itself was turning against her. The front door, her only chance of escape, was a distant memory now, blocked off by the figures around her. Her mind screamed for a way out. Then, a new voice broke through the chaos, low and menacing, yet somehow familiar. You've been a puppet for too long, Evelyn. Evelyn's heart stopped. She knew that voice. She knew it all too well. From the shadows at the edge of the room, a figure emerged, standing tall and confident. His face was obscured by a dark, hooded cloak, but the voice, was unmistakable. Dad, Evelyn whispered, the word barely escaping her lips. Her father, but something about him had changed. His presence was like a weight, pressing on her chest, suffocating her from all sides. He had always been a force in her life, but this wasn't the man she remembered. You were never meant to remember, Evelyn, he said, stepping into the dim light. His face remained hidden, but the power in his voice was undeniable. But now it's time you learned the truth. Evelyn's head swam. The truth, she couldn't escape it. Not anymore. They were all here. Her mother, her father, Jason. Each one of them a part of something she couldn't understand. Something she had been running from for so long. She wanted to scream, but the words were caught in her throat. You think you've been living a life of your own, don't you? Her father continued, his voice low and almost pitying. But all you've ever known has been a lie. Her mind spun in circles. A lie. She had been living her life. She had made choices. She had made a future for herself. Or at least, that's what she thought. The air around her felt thick, heavy with the weight of the moment. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think clearly. And then, a flash of memory, a brief, fleeting image, flashed in her mind. It was so brief, she almost didn't catch it. A figure, a face, a betrayal. No, she couldn't remember. She wasn't ready to remember. Evelyn, her father said again, his voice seeping into her mind, breaking through the panic. It's time to stop running. It's time to accept who you really are. She wanted to deny it. She wanted to scream. But deep down, a part of her knew. She had known all along. The truth was here, staring her in the face, and there was no escaping it now. Evelyn's pulse thrummed in her ears as she stood frozen, unable to tear her gaze from the shadowed figure of her father. The weight of his presence bore down on her, a suffocating force that made her feel smaller, weaker, as if every inch of her life had been a mere illusion. You don't understand, do you? Her father continued, his voice like a slow drip, each word carving its mark into her soul. You've been a puppet in a play you didn't even know you were part of. A cold chill swept through the room, wrapping around her like a cloak. Her breath caught in her throat as she fought the growing sense of dread. A puppet. The word echoed in her mind, a sharp sting. Was she? All your choices, all your actions, they were all part of a bigger plan. You were never free. Jason's laugh cut through the tension, jagged and cruel. She still doesn't get it, do you? You're nothing but a cog in the wheel of something much darker, Evelyn. The mask-wearing figure beside her mother took a step closer, its hollow eyes never leaving her. You think your memories are yours to keep. You think you've been in control. You've been manipulated, just like everyone else. Evelyn felt her legs weaken beneath her. The room tilted as if the very foundations of her world were shifting, sliding out of her grasp. A cold sweat broke out on her forehead. The memories that had been locked away for so long, those fragmented pieces of her past, were suddenly pressing on her, forcing their way to the surface. Too much to bear. The figure with the mask spoke again, its voice a whisper. It's not just about your past. It's about what you've become, who you've become. Her father's voice, still distant yet somehow all-encompassing, rose once more. You are the key, Evelyn. Everything begins and ends with you. The question is, will you accept it, or will you fight it? Her eyes darted around the room, frantic now. The walls felt like they were closing in, the air thick with oppressive energy. The weight of everything, the game, the lies, the secrets, pressed in on her like a vice. No, no, she whispered, shaking her head. I'm not part of this. I'm not who you think I am. Jason's face twisted with mocking pity. That's the thing, Evelyn. You are who we think you are. You just don't remember it yet. Evelyn staggered back, her mind racing, desperate for an escape, any way out. She had to get away from them, away from whatever twisted reality they were forcing her to confront. The door behind her loomed, so close. Just a few more steps. But when she tried to move, something invisible, seemed to grip her. Her mother's voice broke through her panicked thoughts, now eerily soft, almost too gentle. You can't run from this. You can't run from who you are. Her heart hammered in her chest. Was she supposed to remember something? Something she had forgotten. I don't know who you're talking about, she gasped, her throat tight. I'm just me. I'm not anyone else. The figure behind her father, its mask still reflecting no emotion, stepped forward, its presence suffocating. Do you know who you really are, Evelyn? It asked, voice hauntingly familiar, as if it had been with her all along. You've always known. You've always felt it inside you. Terror curled in Evelyn's stomach. No, she croaked. I don't know anything anymore. Jason's cold laugh reverberated in the silence. That's the point, Evelyn. You've always known, but you refuse to see it. The truth is too much for you to handle, but it's here now, and you can't escape it any longer. The figure with the mask loomed closer, its steps deliberate. The air grew heavier with each passing second. Evelyn's hand shook as she reached for the knife, though she didn't know why. It felt like her only defense, even though it was nothing compared to the dark force closing in around her. You can try to fight, her father said, stepping forward, his voice now low and compelling. But you'll never be free until you accept what you are. You're a part of something much bigger than you realize. She felt the darkness pushing in from all sides, suffocating her, closing her in until she could barely breathe. Her chest constricted, and she felt a surge of anger at herself, at them, at the cruel game they were playing. You're lying, she spat, her voice trembling but defiant. This isn't real. This is just a sick joke. Jason shook his head slowly, a look of disdain crossing his face. You've been living a lie for too long, Evelyn. The truth is, you're part of a legacy that's been building for generations. And you, Evelyn, you're at the center of it all. Her heart skipped a beat. Legacy? What was he talking about? What could he possibly mean? I won't let you control me, she shouted, desperate now. I won't be a part of this twisted game. I won't. The figure in the mask lunged forward with a speed she couldn't predict. She barely had time to react before a hand gripped her wrist, forcing the knife from her grasp. No, Evelyn gasped, panic surging through her veins. She struggled, but the strength in the figure's grip was overwhelming. Accept it, Evelyn, the masked figure whispered. You're not in control. You never were. And then, as if in response to the rising tension, a sound echoed through the house, distant but unmistakable. A low, grinding noise, like metal scraping against stone. The walls seemed to tremble. Evelyn's eyes flicked around, frantic. What now? The air grew thick with anticipation, and she knew, deep down, that something was about to happen. Something far worse than she could imagine. The grinding noise grew louder, vibrating through the floor beneath Evelyn's feet. The walls seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, as if they were alive and responding to the tension in the room. The figure holding her wrist didn't move, its grip tightening with each passing second, but the cold, suffocating air around them thickened, pressing in on her chest. Evelyn's mind raced, the weight of the revelation crashing over her like a tidal wave. A legacy. A legacy of what? She couldn't process it, couldn't wrap her head around the fact that all her life had been a carefully constructed lie. But the truth was seeping through the cracks, undeniable. Stop pretending, Jason said, his voice cutting through her thoughts. This is who you are. This is where you belong. Her breath came in ragged gasps. The figure in the mask leaned closer, its presence overwhelming. She could barely see its face, just the dark void where its eyes should have been. But she could feel its power, an ancient, consuming force that threatened to swallow her whole. She struggled, but it was no use. The walls were closing in, and she couldn't breathe. "I won't do this," she whispered, her voice shaking, though every fiber of her being screamed to fight. "I won't be part of your twisted legacy." The masked figure's grip tightened, and Evelyn cried out in pain. "You don't have a choice," it hissed. "The legacy doesn't give you that privilege." Everything inside her screamed to break free, but the weight of the past, of whatever they had built her life around, was suffocating her. Was she really a part of some dark plan? Was her life always meant to be a pawn in someone else's game? A low rumble echoed through the room, like thunder rolling in from miles away. The air was thick with tension, the space between them closing in faster than she could process. And then, without warning, the ground beneath them trembled. The walls shook violently, and Evelyn stumbled, nearly losing her balance. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The figure released its grip on her wrist, just long enough for her to gasp for air, her lungs burning. But the tremor didn't stop. It grew, stronger now, shaking the entire house. The door frame splintered. Dust fell from the ceiling. The low rumbling was growing louder. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, the kind of silence that made you question whether the world was still in motion, or if it had somehow come to a halt. Evelyn's eyes darted around, her mind racing. The ground beneath her feet felt unstable, like the very foundation of the house was cracking open. Something was happening, something that couldn't be ignored. The tension in the room was now unbearable, and for the first time since she had arrived, she felt as though time itself had stopped. Then, the masked figure let go of her wrist completely. She stumbled backward, her heart thundering in her chest. What did you do?" she demanded, her voice weak but desperate. "What's happening?" Jason's face, as cold and calculating as ever, remained eerily calm. "We're just unlocking what was always meant to be. Everything you've seen, everything that's happened, it was always part of the plan." Evelyn's head spun. The plan, the house, the figures surrounding her. It was all part of some greater scheme she couldn't comprehend. But there was something else, something much worse than the suffocating pressure of the truth she couldn't face. Suddenly, a violent screech echoed from below, so loud it rattled her bones. Her heart skipped a beat. She knew that sound. It was coming from the basement. "Stop!" Evelyn shouted, panic rising in her chest. "You have to stop this." But they weren't listening. The figure in the mask was already moving, its steps soundless but swift, heading toward the stairs leading down to the basement. Jason followed, his expression unreadable. "No," Evelyn breathed, the word escaping her lips before she could think. "Not there. Not that place." Her mind flashed back to the moments before, her fleeting memory of a face, a figure standing over her, whispering promises of escape. Asterisk, what had happened in that basement? What had she buried? Asterisk. Without thinking, she ran after them, adrenaline surging through her veins, ignoring the growing ache in her legs. She reached the top of the stairs, just as the masked figure reached the door. It paused, turning its empty face toward her, and for a moment, she saw a flicker of something almost human, beneath the mask. It wasn't just a puppet. "You don't want to see this," it said, its voice unrecognizable. But there was something in the way it spoke that made Evelyn's blood run cold. "You can't stop this, Evelyn," Jason called from behind her, his voice low and almost regretful. "You have no idea what's at stake." The door creaked open. A blast of cold air rushed past her, and the smell of decay and old wood hit her like a wave. She hesitated, her pulse quickening, but she couldn't let them get away. She had to understand. She had to know what was happening. Evelyn stepped forward, her hand reaching for the door, but as she touched the handle, a piercing scream erupted from the depths below. It was so raw, so filled with agony. It cut through her like a knife. The scream, it sounded familiar. She froze. Her mind raced. That voice. It couldn't be. And then, before she could react, the world shifted. The ground beneath her gave way. The walls of the house buckled, the lights flickering violently, plunging the room into darkness. Evelyn's world crumbled. The basement door slammed shut with a deafening bang, locking her out of whatever horrors lay beyond. She pounded on the door, screaming, but the pounding from the other side stopped as suddenly as it had begun. And then there was silence, except for one whisper, barely audible in the pitch black. "You should have stayed away, Evelyn." And the house, whatever was left of it, began to move once again. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as the whisper echoed in the darkness. The cold air pressed down on her chest, thick and suffocating. She could feel the weight of something ancient, something powerful, pressing in from every direction, and she had no idea where it was coming from. Her heart pounded in her ears, each beat a reminder that she was not alone in this house, and whatever was lurking in the shadows was far worse than anything she had imagined. The door to the basement, now closed, locked, felt like a barrier to something she wasn't ready to face. But the sound of footsteps approaching from behind snapped her back into reality. Her pulse quickened, her body stiffening in fear. "Don't," Jason's voice said from the hallway, distant but clear. "You shouldn't have done that." Evelyn spun around, her eyes darting to where he stood, his face barely visible in the dim light that flickered from the broken lamp above. His silhouette was as cold and unmoving as the rest of the house, but it was his eyes, those dark, unyielding eyes, that held her captive. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice rising, sharp with panic. "What's happening to me? To this house?" Jason stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "You've always known, Evelyn. It's all been leading to this moment. The house, it's alive. And so are you." Her breath hitched. "Alive? What do you mean?" Jason's lips curled into a thin, mocking smile. "You think it's just a house? No, it's a vessel. It's been waiting for you. And now that you're here, now that you've unlocked what was hidden, it's too late. The game is in motion." A low rumbling began again, as if the very bones of the house were shifting, awakening. The walls groaned, the floorboards creaking in protest. Evelyn felt the ground beneath her tremble, as though something enormous, something monstrous, was stirring beneath the surface. "Everything in this house has a purpose," Jason continued, his voice colder now. "You were never meant to leave, Evelyn. No one does." Evelyn staggered back, her mind reeling. "What do you mean, no one does? What happens to the people who come here? What happens to me?" Her father's voice cut through the tension, deep and laden with some dark satisfaction. "You're not meant to understand yet, Evelyn, but you will, when the time comes." She turned, eyes frantic, but she was already too late. The walls of the hallway around her seemed to close in, narrowing, pressing her toward the center of the house. It felt like the house itself was alive, pulling her, guiding her to some unknown fate. "You have no choice," Jason's voice echoed again, his tone final. "You can't run from what's already been set in motion." Her heart hammered against her chest as she backed into a corner, her mind racing to comprehend the weight of the situation. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as if the house itself was breathing, waiting for her to make the next move. Suddenly, a sharp crack rang out, and the floor beneath her feet trembled violently. The tremor rattled her teeth, and the entire house seemed to groan under some unseen pressure. Evelyn fell to her knees, hands gripping the floor to steady herself. "What the hell is happening?" she screamed. The figure in the mask, who had been silently watching from the doorway, stepped forward, its head tilted slightly, as if it were studying her, an eerie, unnerving motion. "You should have stayed in the dark," it said in a voice that sounded almost disappointed. "The house is alive because you're alive, and the more you resist, the more you will become part of it. This place, it feeds off you." Evelyn's mind reeled, her thoughts spinning faster than she could process. "Feeds off me? What does that mean? Why me? Why now?" Before anyone could answer, the house shuddered again. But this time the tremors were different. They were sharp, jagged, like something breaking apart deep within the earth. The air grew colder, and Evelyn's skin prickled with an instinctive, primal fear. From the basement, a voice rose, familiar, desperate, and full of pain. The sound of a person, no, someone she knew, screaming. "Evelyn!" the voice cried, rising in pitch. "Evelyn, help me!" Her breath caught in her throat as she recognized the voice. Her mother. Her heart stopped. It was her mother, calling from the basement, begging for help, her tone ragged with panic and terror. Evelyn's mind spiraled. How could this be? How could her mother be down there? She thought she had left her behind. Hadn't she been gone for so long? "Evelyn," Jason said softly, his eyes darkening. "You're too late. She's gone. She's always been gone." The words hit her like a physical blow, but she couldn't let herself believe them. She had to help her mother. She had to. The mask-wearing figure stepped forward again, blocking her path. "You can't save her. No one can. Not anymore." Desperation clawed at Evelyn's chest, but she pushed it aside, forcing herself to focus. The scream from the basement was getting louder, more frantic, more filled with terror. Without thinking, she bolted forward, shoving the figure aside, ignoring the sharp pain in her chest as she sprinted toward the stairs. Evelyn stopped. Jason shouted after her, but she couldn't hear him. All that mattered was the voice from the basement. She had to reach it, no matter what. The house seemed to resist, every step up the stairs a battle against some unseen force. But Evelyn pushed on. She could feel the floor beneath her shifting, could hear the walls groaning in protest, as if they were alive and trying to drag her down. She reached the basement door. The scream stopped abruptly. For a moment, all that was left was silence. Her hand hovered over the doorknob, and she could feel the heat radiating from the other side. She hesitated, heart pounding, every instinct telling her to turn away. But she couldn't. She wouldn't. With trembling hands, she twisted the knob and forced the door open. And then the world went black. The last thing she heard was her own voice, shaking with fear, whispering, "What is this place?" Before everything around her collapsed into darkness. The world slowly shifted back into focus, but not in the way Evelyn had expected. Instead of a basement, she found herself standing in a quiet field under a sky painted with the soft hues of dawn. The air was cool, the grass beneath her feet still damp with morning dew. For a moment, she was disoriented, her heart racing in her chest. She had expected darkness, chaos, the endless pressure of the house closing in on her. But here, everything was peaceful, still, and serene. She blinked, looking around. The house was gone. The terrifying walls, the figures, the voices, all of it had vanished, as if they had never existed at all. Only the endless expanse of the field stretched out before her, quiet and untouched. Evelyn took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill her lungs. It was a relief. A weight lifted from her chest, but questions still lingered in her mind. Asterisk, was it all a dream? Had it been real? Asterisk. But before she could ponder any further, she heard a voice behind her. Evelyn. Her heart skipped a beat. She turned, and there, standing just a few feet away, was her mother, alive, unharmed, her face soft and serene. "Mom," Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling. "But how are you here? You..." Her mother smiled gently, her eyes filled with warmth. "I've always been here, Evelyn. You just needed to believe in the right things to find me." "But the house," Evelyn said, her voice cracking. "The basement." Her mother's smile deepened. "It wasn't about the house, darling. It was about you, about your strength to break free from what held you back." She stepped forward, embracing Evelyn in a gentle, comforting hug. "You've come so far, Evelyn. You're free now." Tears welled up in Evelyn's eyes as she held her mother tightly, the weight of everything finally lifting from her shoulders. The confusion, the fear, it was all fading away. She was safe. She was free. And more importantly, she wasn't alone. As the soft light of dawn bathed them both in its glow, Evelyn realized that the nightmare she had lived through was no longer her reality. The house, the figures, the mystery, it was all part of a journey, a painful but necessary one. But now she was home, and home was where her heart felt at peace. Evelyn pulled back, wiping her eyes, and smiled. "I don't know how to thank you. I don't know how to even explain this." Her mother laughed softly, the sound as familiar and comforting as it had always been. "You don't need to explain it. You've done everything you needed to do. Now it's time to move on, to live the life you were always meant to live." Evelyn nodded, her heart light and full. It was over. She could finally let go. With one last, lingering look at her mother, Evelyn turned toward the horizon. The future stretched out before her, full of possibilities and new beginnings. As the sun rose higher, she felt a sense of peace settle over her, knowing that the past was no longer something that defined her. She was free to step into the light, to embrace whatever came next. And just as she took her first step forward, the soft, familiar voice of the narrator echoed in her mind. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and follow us for more thrilling adventures, mysteries, and tales that will keep you coming back for more. Until next time, remember, there's always a new story just around the corner.